Let's talk about some of those priors because you in your introduction you talk about the Spencer Wells and who developed the standard interpretation of human evolution and migration. Tell us what that is,
Yeah,
and then let's uncover, I guess, the legacy ideas that help formulate that.
sure. So in its simplest form, what Spencer Wells is doing post 2000, which is the moment where geneticists are able to look at the genetic diversity across human groups, and we're able to trace the Y chromosome lineage to be able to find that humans share genetic ancestry that can be traced back to Africa, right? And that this then, what spells is what Spencer Wells is doing is trying to narrate a story of migration out of Africa into Australia and then into other parts of the world. And genetically, this has been the narrative that has carried the day, if you will, within the ways in which we think about human population emergence and dispersal. Okay, and it proceeds on a model of dispersal and replacement in that, at its core, if we think about it, it involves a population that is collected in Africa and then a small version of them move to another region in the world. Then create a kind of population diversity, and then a small group of them move to another region of the world. And this continues all the way into the Americas. And what's interesting about that model is that there are some philosophical assumptions behind it. Part of those assumptions involve when populations coalesce and come together, they generate a kind of homogeneous set of traits that then when a member or a small group break apart from that larger group, those traits get carried over to some degree into the creation of a new population. And then there's another sort of body of collection of humans that then a small group breaks apart and disperses. And it's that dispersal and movement that allows for geneticists to talk about the sort of common shared human ancestry. But there's a flaw to this way of thinking. And that is, firstly, it tends to create a narrative where we imagine that the populations that were left were static, that they didn't change biologically, that they remained genetically what they were, and therefore the Africans and the Aboriginals and the Europeans and the Asians, they are roughly sort of kind of clear homogeneous groups that are genetically similar. What we know from contemporary genetic research, there's a tremendous amount of genetic diversity in Africa alone. It's one of the most genetically diverse places in the world because of all the amount of genetic recombination that's taken place over multiple generations. We also know with recent ancestral research, populations in Africa continue to move to and from the Middle East into Europe and back into Africa, creating a kind of continuous process of genetic mixture and diversity. So much so that it becomes very difficult to even talk about Africa as a stable genetic population. And this same is true for populations in Australia, populations in Europe and Asia, and in North America, right? But it is conceptually clean and easy to imagine human diversity in terms of a few sort of pure or homogeneous genetic populations, right? Now, what I've done in my book then is to think about historical precedents where this form of thinking has happened before Spencer Wells. And when we tell that story, that involves a larger historical arc that you can trace back to the early church, and you can trace to the formation of early modern biology, where coming out of what I call Christian intellectual history, which describes a set of ideas and philosophies and reasoning strategies that were part of Christian thinking that influence the way ethnologists and early natural historians, and these are people who we would call sort of contemporary scientists, the way that they studied the natural world. And these Christian assumptions brought with them ideas about population emergence and dispersal. We often forget Christianity is not just a religion about heaven and earth and salvation. It's also a religion that has a lot of ideas about where populations emerge and where they disperse. And this is actually not unique to Christianity. All of the Abrahamic faith traditions, which includes Judaism and Islam, share the story of Noah, for example, which is a story that explains the emergence of an original population that are descendants of Adam, and that population then disperses. God is upset with human groups and chooses a select few to be saved. This is sort of Noah and his sons. The human populations that are on the globe are wiped out through a global sort of deluge catastrophe. And then Noah's sons disembark on the ark, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth then literally repopulate the earth, giving us Asia, Europe, and Africa. If you look in the 9th century and the 6th century, you begin to see the emergence of this story being used to talk about the continental ancestries of human groups. Isidore Seville is an encyclopedia in Spain who creates these original maps called TO maps, and these maps are a division of the world into 3 different quadrants, or 3 different circles, or sections rather. And these sections have Asia, Europe, and Africa, but then also written up below them are the names of Noah's 3 sons, and that these maps get reproduced from the 6th century all the way up until as late as the 13th century. And they're being dispersed and used all throughout Europe to imagine the kind of interconnection of all the racial groups, but more importantly, create a kind of intellectual model for thinking about human diversity from a common ancestor and then the emergence of subsequent groups. So when we think about that, and then we then think about the conceptual models that geneticists are using that involve population emergence, population dispersal, and eventually population replacement, there are clear conceptual lineages at work here. It is not, Spencer Wells is not sort of creating ex nihilo a model of thinking about humans descending from a common ancestor. He is standing within an intellectual trajectory that is deeply connected to Christian Western thinking about race and human emergence, and my book is trying to unpack that story.
Now, that that is known, and correct me if I'm wrong, as monogenism.
Monogenism. Yeah.
Okay, monogenism, and so the argument is that the framework for that monogenism is a function of sort of, I guess, archetypal, Judeo-Christian stories, essentially.
Yes.
And so now, is there no? I mean, and is the idea that there's really no way of testing either that story of monogenism, or is it that we shouldn't even be, or there's no testing of the concept of monogenism as opposed to polygenism? I mean,
so that's So yes, you're right. I'm arguing that there is a kind of intellectual lineage that starts with a very kind of specific theological story about human diversity that then gets translated into what we could say a secular or scientific story that still carries with it those earlier Christian elements. Yes, I'm surely saying that. But to your question, though, which if I can phrase it a little differently, what you're asking is, well, just because it comes from Christianity, does that mean that that isn't true? Right? Is what the geneticists are finding in the genome, which seems to suggest that there's evidence of common ancestry, does that mean that common ancestry is merely a myth or an illusion? If I hear you correctly, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, that's a cleaner way of stating it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that I have trouble buying, but the idea that maybe there was a big family and they all went to different parts of the world. Maybe there were 3 of them, but that. I mean, that to me. Is that testable? Has that been tested? Is that I mean, maybe maybe there was a Noah's Ark. I mean, I don't.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, so what I'm trying to say, and this gets me back to how I started. What I'm trying to say is that science proceeds on cultural history, and it is informed by questions of belief. Okay, and what I'm really trying to argue is not dispute necessarily if common human ancestry is real or not. I'm asking a different question, which is, why do we continue to need this idea? And is it an innate idea that all humans have in all places? Or is it an idea that is useful socially, politically, and scientifically, right? And that therefore the things that we supposedly discover or study in the lab how much of that is actually a result of our own creation, right? That we're creating the genetic story that link us together in this kind of common human framework because we value common human ancestry. One could imagine, for example, a different type of social cosmology where common human ancestry isn't necessarily the guiding framework for thinking about human diversity. And in fact, some population geneticists who are beginning to really take seriously the kind of complexity of ancient DNA and our ancient hominid ancestors, this includes the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the red deer people, populations that we didn't really know how genetically diverse they were until about 8 years ago with the first Neanderthal genome sequencing. What we're beginning to realize is that there's so much genetic complexity taking place in among our ancient ancestors, and even among sort of the sort of first populations that would be anatomically modern, that sometimes it's not necessarily useful to talk about that diversity as being derived from a common single ancestor. There might be another interpretive framework that could be more useful for talking about that diversity. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not all linked biologically. It just means shifting the conversation a bit. Now, to your question, if I can get it at a more specific way, what I'm trying to get us to realize is that science has not fully extricated itself from the kind of religious patterning of its past, and that particularly in the West, we've inherited certain ideas and beliefs that have become deeply integrated into our political life, deeply integrated into our scientific life, and that this is not necessarily a bad thing. The point of raising our awareness of this is to say, look, if there is this sort of remnant of Christian thinking in the way in which biologists think about race, we need to firstly look at this with kind of unflinching courage and say, fine, this may be happening, and then question the degree to which is this useful or not? Are we creating scientific projects that actually help us understand the complexity of human life? Or could it be that race thinking within biology and genetics, and a lot of my colleagues actually would think this, doesn't actually help us understand the complexity of social life? Just to give you just an example. A few years ago, there was a research study done by the Sigma Consortium, which is a collection of geneticists who are working in Latin America and Mexico, and they are supported by the research of Carlos Slim, who is one of the world's most wealthiest men. And this consortium is looking to try to understand the genetic basis of diseases that specifically afflict Latin Americans and Mexican populations. And one of the things that the consortium is interested in is type 2 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is a sort of a chronic disease that actually takes place later in life. It's not a disease like type 1 diabetes, which is actually inherited. Type 2 diabetes, potentially, given one's diet and sort of nutrition, one can develop type 2 diabetes over one's lifespan. In any case, the researchers are still interested in perhaps trying to understand why Mexican populations might have elevated risk of type 2 diabetes. As a result of our sequencing the Neanderthal genome, we've learned that apparently Neanderthals have a risk allele that is somewhat associated with type 2 diabetes among them as a species, but then also potentially within humans who intermated with them. And as it turns out, there's a specific risk allele that appears in Mexican populations that increases their chances of getting type 2 diabetes by 50%. Okay? Now, in order for this story to work, what we have to imagine is that an allele that gets introduced into the human population around 30,000 years ago has traveled through Europe and Asia, has made its way across the Bering Strait into North America and into South America, and then has been in the bodies of native populations, and then has led to being within Mexican groups, right? And that this gene has traveled this 30,000 years and is responsible for elevated risk for type 2 diabetes. Now, there are problems with this story. Firstly, we know that type 2 diabetes can be corrected or prevented through the measures I've already mentioned, social measures, right? Access to nutrition, diet, healthcare, these sorts of things. Access to preventative drugs and therapies. Preventative treatment from physicians. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to look for a gene for a disease that we know can be corrected by social causes, right? But secondly, if we actually think about this scientifically, there are some other flaws, because in order for this gene to be responsible for this risk, we would have to assume that it would have to be in Native American populations in 5,000 years ago. And working with some colleagues of mine who actually specifically study this, and my colleague Deborah Bolnick, who is at UT Austin, we've actually looked at Native American populations some 5,000 years ago. And what we've actually found is that, yes, this risk allele is present, but the biomarkers for type 2 diabetes are not really prevalent. So what this means is that, yes, the gene is there, and it's actually there in a fairly high frequency, a higher frequency than what we find in current Mexican populations. But we don't actually find the biomarkers for disease. But in present Mexican groups, what we find instead is that the gene is there, but in a lower frequency, but type 2 diabetes is all over the place. So what this says is that the environment is what is actually causing this disease, not a kind of visualization or conceptualization of race and genetics that might be explaining this disease.
But couldn't it be? I mean, and I'm, but couldn't it be that there is simply a higher risk that is there that then interacts with the context of diet or of changes in the environment or whatever, something outside cultural things that have changed, so that the interplay between the genetics and the context outside of the environment, broadly speaking, that dynamic changes. So 5,000 years ago, you have less of a concentration, or you have more of a concentration of that gene. You have less indication that type 2 diabetes is a problem, but the mere existence of that gene in any quantity mixed with, an increase in eating of corn. I'm just guessing, but I would imagine scientists go in and they say, we're going to control for these variables. And is the question, is it not a worthy pursuit, generally speaking, to say, does the presence of a gene increase the possibility based upon environmental factors? Or are you saying that if environmental factors are playing 75 to 80% or 90% of the role, then it's the genetic component is largely irrelevant?
No, firstly, genes only ever operate in a social environment, period, right? Genes are in humans, and humans exist within a social environment and a political environment and an economic one, right? And so that if we're going to talk about the effect that a gene may or may not be doing, scientists, you need to be responsible for thinking about the actual social political environment under which that gene is doing something, right? And so in that sense, what we need to be doing is I'm not saying that there may not be a risk here. What I'm saying, however, is that there's a narrative to be told about what that risk might actually be, right? It's not simply the case that if the gene is present, we should expect it to necessarily manifest in disease. As it turns out, if you're going to think about, well, why might Native American and Mexican populations be at an elevated risk for type 2 diabetes, we have to talk about colonization. We have to talk about the dispossession of land, and therefore the changing of foodways that Native American populations underwent. We have to talk about the stress factors involved with experiencing racial genocide and what that actually means in terms of the ancestors of those people who survived those genocidal political projects. And then we also have to talk about the transition in the lifestyle and the diets and the social environment of current Mexican populations, both in Mexico as well as those who are moving to the United States. These are messy details that often geneticists or biologists do want to control for, but I think it flattens the complexity of the story. It says simply that colonization and legacy of racism, these things do have an effect on the bodies of people, and it also elevates their risk for disease and illness. And this is part of the story that many scientists don't want to talk about, right? And if you actually look at the study of the Sigma Consortium, they mentioned, yes, this could be one factor among many in terms of trying to explain type 2 diabetes, But if we think about the larger historical narrative, that part isn't there. The actual narrative of dispossession and what this does to humans' bodies. So what I'm trying to say, and you did say this in your initial response, it's a complex story in that we need to be thinking about genetics and biology and society as always interrelated with one another. And in the case of type 2 diabetes, it just turns out that you can think about the history of the disease without knowledge really of its genetics. I mean, we've already known from countless studies done by public health researchers like my colleague Claudia Chafin, who's at York University in Canada, who's been a leading expert on looking at the development of type 2 diabetes in particular. We know that actually these are diseases that can be understood and change. And this is a larger point. Why are we studying this to begin with? It's about social change. It's about making people better. And if we can do that without looking at the genes, if we can do that by looking at, like I've mentioned, diet, exercise, access to health care, these social, political measures, that is the thing that we should be focusing on, right?
I see what, and so to a certain extent, this is a story of the guy who shows up at the job site with a hammer, and so everything gets hammered. And well, in some instances, a saw is actually going to work better. Well, if you give me enough time with a hammer, I can break that 2x4. It's that
exactly. Okay. Yes, and this is my larger point, which is all of this gets set into motion because of a commitment to thinking in racial terms.